It's very nice to be here with you. When Francis reached out to us and asked whether or not we could do a presentation on the patient summaries and Gazelle, we said yes, of course, but this is not about African wildlife, so I decided to rename the title of the presentation to basically patient summary and interoperability testing, because some of you may know this, but most of you probably don't. Gazelle is the name of the platform that helps us with interoperability testing. So I thought I would make that clarification from the top. For today, the agenda of the presentation is on the screen right now. I thought I would do probably a very lightweight introduction to PS.CA. There's several links in the presentation today. You'll be able to actually go and follow those links, and it will take you home to where the specification is published, is publicly available. You don't need to log into anything. And you will find a ton more information where those links lead you to. But I just wanted to give you sort of 30,000 feet overview of what this is, how it came about, what it covers. And it also provides us an opportunity to talk to some of the aspects that Abby just presented in the previous presentation. And I noticed some of you had very interesting questions about it. So I'm assuming that this might actually pique your interests, and I wouldn't be surprised if those questions will continue with a little bit more in-depth conversations on some of the aspects of the patient summary. So that's why we wanted to bring this forward, to raise the awareness of the of those that are involved in the space, and to provide Q&A, and hoping that you're going to become partners in this journey of interoperability. So starting from the top, PS.CA and IPS. Some of you might have heard of the IPS. It stands for International Patient Summary. It is a specification that was born out of Europe. There's several standards organizations that have picked it up since. It's several years old now. The main intent for it was to allow for patients to have a mechanism by which they can take an extract of their patient record with them when they're doing cross-country travel, as in within a European Union. But then it became a very successful approach to this type of summary sharing, and ISO picked it up, and then HL7 International, IHE, and several other organizations got involved through the Joint Initiative Council, which is also an international table that brings together the SDOs. And Canada wanted to help jurisdictions in sort of synchronizing their approach to defining a proper patient summary for Canada. Efforts have been underway for years. You have seen the statistics as to how low our adoption rates were in the area of summaries. And we're basically trying to help the market with a patient summary for Canada that is 100% based on IPS. What you see here is bolded, were some of the guiding principles that we wanted to take into account when this was developed. We wanted to make sure it is implementable, it is a testable specification, and it is based on the core IPS. So we didn't want to make basically just another paperweight that is going to sit on a shelf. We wanted the Canadian implementers to be able to adopt this. So what does the specification cover? It definitely defines the building blocks, data model, and the interoperability specification to allow for a condition-independent and specialty agnostic sharing of patient summaries. So with that in mind, last year, probably January, February, we got engaged with a number of jurisdictions. We told the story across Canada. And as Abby mentioned in the previous presentation, 5 jurisdictions actually stepped forward to be active participants in the development of the PS.CA specification. You see them in the header of the table on the right side: Alberta, BC, Newfoundland, Ontario, and Saskatchewan. We got started probably around March, April with setting up some governance capabilities to organize ourselves and make decisions. And once that baseline was established and the collaboration was established, then we got going and started developing the specification. We went through several review cycles that I'm going to talk about a bit later, and finally got it published. And now we're in the last stages of that process. You can see there the recommend and iterate on the left side. We're expecting the coordinating and executive tables to finally reach that state where they are approving and then recommending the specification for broad use. What I want to emphasize about the specification is one of the lessons learned from previous work where Infoway was active in the standards arena in the past. Some of you probably were part of that and you remember this very well. We learned through trial and error that just core standards are not sufficient for interoperability to flourish. So just by saying thou shall use FHIR or that you should use this particular standard is not sufficient because there's variability in the use of a standard. So what we try to do here is recognizing that you have to cover both the information modeling and the proper exchange of that information model. We call the patient summary standard the level 2 standard. And what we mean by that is it covers both the content, as in the FHIR data model, the LOINCs, NOMAD, code sets or terminologies, semantic components. And then it also covers the transport, as in what type of operations you would want to have and what type of standardized patterns can be used in the industry to cover for this. And I would like to highlight an interesting and most often overlooked aspect of interoperability. Every single time you develop a specification, the focus is on the specification. And there is a tendency to sort of overlook the fact that no specification will ever exist in a void. It will always be part of a continuum of an ecosystem, right? And what we try to highlight on the right side of this picture is that that continuum includes the challenges that arise when you're trying to, for example, identify a patient, or challenges that arise when you want to know if you have consent from the patient to share a summary, or you need to identify a physician that authored that summary, or you want to identify a service where you would like it delivered. So these are very real and concrete examples of where interoperability fails. You can have the best defined patient summary, but if you cannot share it naturally and without extra effort, then interoperability will not work. So what we try to do is recognizing that this linkage exists. We design the patient summary so that it covers for all those aspects. So if I were to just look at the core components of what the patient summary currently has, the release of the patient summary specification was designed to be in 4 parts. So the links on this site basically will take you to the specification home, at which point you can download the PDF versions of these documents as well as you can browse them online. You can see that we have 2 core specification modules and 2 related supporting ones. We call them companion guides. One companion guide is to the reference architecture, and this is that part that is talking about some of the challenges I presented a minute ago about integration of the patient summary in the ecosystem. And the other one talks about the business requirements and use cases, as in what type of challenges you might want to consider or plan for when you are an integrator of a summary. And then the core ones, we have a package called the summary, the patient summary interoperable specification itself on the left side. And this is the umbrella specification that puts it all together, but it references the FHIR profiles and implementation guide package that sits on Simplifier, and that is on Simplifier because Simplifier is a tool that knows how to render FHIR profiles, knows how to actively create implementation guides that render FHIR profiles and gives just a so much better user experience when you're consuming, when you're an implementer, for example. So these 4 documents together define the patient summary specification package. The top one on the diagram is for the content data model, and then the reference architecture is lower. The specification, as I said, brings it together. You also see something on the page called CAFAX. I will touch briefly on it, but enough to say that CAFAX is a Canadian packaged integration pattern. IHE International uses a term integration profile. So you could think of it as an integration profile that was designed and built in Canada based on international research on the best practices for FHIR integrations. And it is covering in this first version what you need to know if you want to exchange native FHIR documents that are structured. So that specification also relates to here. And I'm going to talk to it a little bit later when we reach reference architecture. So let's start on the top with the content data model. So the content data model is, the audience for this is definitely solution developers. This is a fairly technical document, but from a business perspective, I would say this is probably the picture that you most care about. We tried to put everything in one single picture because, you know, a picture is 1,000 words. But what you see in this picture is the left side column shows the International Patient Summary Universal Version, UV. And this is the data domains that the IPS contains. I know it's a little bit hard to see, but all these are available in that package that I mentioned online. So you'll be able to read it better. And then the PS.CA is next to the right. And what you see is 100% alignment to the ones on the left, but there are small exceptions. And before I talk about those exceptions, I want to also highlight the center of the picture, which is the gray rectangles. Those rectangles are expressed commitment from jurisdictions that participated as to where would they want to implement data domains from the patient summary. Like what is their focus in the short and longer term. So you can see that most of the interest bulked up on the top of the patient summary. And because we didn't want to boil the ocean from the first release, we decided in collaboration with jurisdictions, and this is why you have governance committees, that for release one, we're going to take the top half of the profiles, of the data domains, and a couple from the optional category, the green one. And we would bundle them up in the first release so that jurisdictions can get going and will probably be able to cover about 80% of what they want right away. And we will be able to use lessons learned in the process, and we'll go for a second release where the entire scope of the IPS will be updated. Plus, you see the plus signs in the previous release one scope. Release one could also receive enhancements and adjustments depending on what we learn in its use. So final note on this one before I move on, you can see that PS.CA does not have red components. This was a decision reached at the coordinating table where we felt that some of the clinical business flows wanted the flexibility to decide what is it that they would like to consider in generation of a patient summary. Some specialties potentially do not require, I don't know, problem list or medication summary. To give you an example, Saskatchewan wanted to use the patient summary as an opportunity to also share advanced directives for a patient. So if a patient sees their primary care physician and says, I want to change my advanced directives and emergency departments need to know about this, well, problem list or medication history may have no relevance there, right? So why force it to be included in order to create a specific patient summary for a particular event? So those were the considerations. So we relaxed those a little bit, but in terms of alignment and content, they're very, very close to IPS. All the details about this can be read on Simplifier, as I mentioned. That's the Canadian FHIR registry. And there's a project there, PS.CA. And you will see there that there's an implementation guide that talks about a number of aspects of the implementation of patient summary, as well as gives access to all the profiles for the patient summary FHIR resources. So then moving to the other core document, which is the umbrella document, the PS.CA specifications, this is covering a lot more. It's trying to cover the clinical business aspects, including use cases and some of the requirements around them. Therefore, it's got a broader audience. I think it's fair to say that policymakers and health system planners should also look at this document because it talks a little bit to the scope of what it covers and how it covers it. So with that, we thought that if we were to bring a sample from the specification document, again, it's a little bit hard to see, but I can certainly talk to it. What we did here is we started that collaborative effort with jurisdictions to capture what are the most important use cases that we would like to cover with especially the first release. Although I have to say in the process of collaboration, we went way beyond first release. We captured about 5 or 6 major use cases and then decided to start with the first 3 that are core to sharing. And you saw that it was in the previous slide where we had the 3 use cases listed. Fundamentally, creation of a patient summary, upload of a patient summary to a central repository, and download of it by clinicians and patients, or consumption of it, not necessarily download. So those were the core elements. And the way the use cases are authored in this document, it's also mapped to the table you're seeing in front of you. And the philosophy here is that you have the business flow of what you would expect to see in a clinical setting. And to anticipate some of your questions, yes, clinicians were definitely involved in this. Some medical organizations were very much part of it. And we also had clinician engagement sessions on all this content. I'm not saying all problems have been resolved, but we tried to address as much as we could. So those clinical scenarios then were broken down into pieces, components. And what you see here is it says, for example, the actor name, somebody produces a patient summary. So we call it the PS.CA producer. It lists the actions that the service should support, whatever system creates this patient summary. And you have authenticate the user, identify the patient, pull their data from wherever you have to, assemble it, review it, check for terminology, and then upload the generated summary to a central service, right? And then there's an optionality and the required type of designation for each of these services. And then what we did on the right side, where you see profile standard, we tried to say where there are patterns that already describe how you should do this operation, we encourage the market to adopt those patterns. And most of these patterns usually come from IHE International. I'm going to talk a little bit later about IHE International, enough to say at this point that they structure access to information and transactional patterns into so-called integration profiles. And they have very clear names and very clear actor transactions. And that's what we tried to use. You see there in that column saying profile standard that we listed the IHE patterns, integration patterns that existed already and that we think are very well aligned to this problem space. So by doing this mapping, we only were left with a very small part of interoperability that wasn't really covered well. And so in order to cover that part as well, we decided that the best way to analyze this is to look at the ecosystem and try to map the type of services you would expect from the perspective of a patient summary. So one of the companion guides that I pointed out in the beginning is, again, a document that talks a little bit more holistically about the space with a focus on patient summary, of course. And it's, again, intended to C-level leaders, technical leaders, CMIOs, because we are trying to instill sort of a focus on trying to sort of group the services that you want to use within your organization, province, jurisdiction, you name it, in standardizable pieces of interoperability so that we can put a proper specification in front of it and everybody understands how to use that service, right? So with that, we arrived at something that we call the reference architecture that support the patient summary CA. Again, this is even harder for you to read than the previous ones. You will have a high quality image on the site. You can download it from there. But what you see here is we sort of segmented the space into the expected government or jurisdictional systems that are usually maintained by e-health organizations or ministries of health, but even hospitals potentially, or other systems. And then you have clinical systems like the EMRs, potentially even HISs and other EHR systems. And we wanted to create this delineation in that every system has a role to play in this exchange. And we tried to map all these system capabilities back to IHE profiles, integration profiles, including using their names. So for example, what you see there in more bolded colors, the darker ones, are the required pieces that we would expect in an ecosystem, whereas the lighter ones represent the ones that are in that table I just showed you, but are the optional ones. So using this, you could, for example, imagine that if you want to update your EMR system to support patient summaries, you would want to pick at least one of the integration options from the bolded ones. And this is where CAFAX, the Canadian FHIR Exchange standard specification, was a new integration pattern that was developed as part of the PS.CA program. This was in response to advanced work that Ontario has done that was identifying a more modern way of using integration patterns using core FHIR, as opposed to the existing ways that are also proper, but they're using a little bit more the document-centered model from US, MHD, for example. And those ones are all represented as choices for implementers, but these are the choices. You do not have other choices. That's basically what allows people to still design their systems in such a way that represents their local needs, but makes it very clear that if you make a statement that you can support integration of a patient summary, you will have to state which option are you supporting. You can support both, you can support, but you cannot support a third or fourth one that doesn't exist in this picture, right? So that's the idea with the reference architecture. And then once the package was all done and put together, then we decided from the get-go to go through 3 cycles of review. The first cycle was predominantly focused on the collaborators, as in jurisdictions, vendors, clinicians that were closely aligned with the development of the specification. And once that cycle was ready, we made an update to all of these. And if you notice something very subtle on this diagram, but it's very important to point out because it goes to show the power of governance and collaborative work. CAFAX did not exist in the first review cycle. The first review cycle only pointed to IHE-based profiles. And it was in the process of this cycle review that Ontario actually pointed out that there's core FHIR operations that they would like to also entertain as options. And that's what triggered in the middle of December of last year, a very high-paced activity to try to reach out to US and to other parts of the world to see what's coming in FHIR that is state-of-the-art and top of the line. And all that was collected into the CAFAX specification, and the first draft for review was launched by the end of January. So went through 2 cycles of review, and the PS.CA went through 3 cycles of review. The last one was by design put in such a way that we wanted it to cradle the Projectathon. So let me talk about the Projectathon, because this is that part where African wildlife comes into play. So some of you have heard of IHE International, some of you may not. IHE International is a standards development organization. They've been in business for decades. I was significantly younger when I went to the first Connectathon. They used to organize in Chicago underground parking at the RSNA building. I was surprised and in awe to see how diagnostic imaging complexity at the time was just made sense by the testing that we were doing between vendors using IHE methodology and their integration profiles. Back then it was DICOM because it's diagnostic imaging, but that same construct and concept translates and grows very, very well to use other standards. They do not develop standards. They basically just package the best integration formats through their methodology into these integration profiles. So when we started the PS.CA program, we made a conscious choice to use their methodology and to inform jurisdictions that were working with us that we are going to follow this and we're going to develop a reference architecture, and that you are going to be able to see what integration profiles are we going to support for what type of operation. And this is very good because IHE is the organization that over the decades that they were in existence have gotten better and better at testing interoperability live between vendor systems by using these concepts of integration profiles. So Gazelle is this integration platform that is a test management tool in a way that contains a number of simulators, validators, but it also contains a proxy that basically sits in the middle and all vendors connect to it, and it watches all the traffic. And then vendors can make claims that they support one profile or another, and Gazelle understands what that means in context, and it will watch whether or not the transfer of information that vendors are doing lives up to the expectation of that profile. And it does a grading on it. It gives you an opportunity to debug if something doesn't work. And so these connectivity events are usually done at Connectathons. When they're done in a country or in a smaller locale focused on a particular problem you're solving, they're called projectathons. That's why Canada had the first projectathon basically as part of the PS.CA program development. And a little bit of background for Gazelle. This is one of the user interfaces that you're seeing there. Again, it's very hard to read, but the way it's organized is that you can select the domain in which you want to be tested, what kind of profiles. You can define the transactions you're supporting, options if there are, and then you can start configuring your system and choose the other vendors that you would want to transact with. So we learned a lot, I gotta say, during the Projectathon. I have a couple of slides that are going to talk about it, but we feel that this is definitely a very practical and black and white way of telling if somebody truly supports something or are they just making false claims. And so we are encouraging the market to adopt this approach. Speaking of adoption, this is a quick overview of some of the worldwide leaders that are using Gazelle. So I think we're in good company there. And so for the project, for the PS.CA, the following components were used in Gazelle. We had the left side is all the profiles that we were hoping to test for. These are the ones you will find in the reference architecture. They're all listed there in those boxes. And what you see in green is where Gazelle had capabilities to support vendors before the Projectathon event, meaning vendors could sign up to participate and then they could connect to Gazelle and do a number of tests as if they were doing it against another vendor, but it was basically against simulators, so that they could make sure that, yes, they are at least prepared at the baseline level to go into a live event with others, so that you're not wasting other people's time if your system is not capable to do this. There were unfortunately a couple that we couldn't find simulators for, and for a few that you see there in green on the left side, InfoWay simulator, we ended up building a number of simulators to make sure that we were supporting the new specification, for example, for CAFEX, which is, as I said, a Canadian developed specification, and MHD, which is probably one of the most relevant IHE specifications that are appropriate for patient summary exchange. And there was no simulator for it either, so we decided to build a simulator. So in the end, there's a number of tools that we have created, and the second line there gives you the URL of the Gazelle. This is the Canadian version of the Gazelle platform. It is maintained for us in the cloud by IHE Catalyst, which is an affiliate of IHE International, and we have a contract with them to support this version for Canadian use. So They were the partner organization that helped us set up and run the Projectathon. There are several details available about this on our InfoScribe platform. Again, all these links are available to you. And then what we did is the two simulators that I mentioned are available behind that open API link. And we also built a FHIR renderer, which is an online web application that you can throw a patient summary FHIR document at, and it will render it for you and do some light validation to see if you actually build it properly. Did you cover the right data domains? Did you do them in the right format? But it doesn't do 100% validation yet. And then we had a number of test plans that were executed for this and developed some clinical scenarios with real clinical data where we wanted vendors to be able to show that that data set, how did that data set flow through their systems? That's what we wanted. So despite of the very, very short time we had to set up, basically a good 6 to 8 weeks between publishing the specification and talking about the Projectathon, we were very fortunate to have a couple of leading organizations in Canada step forward and jump in to want to do the Projectathon. You see the 5 organizations that have joined us, Allscripts, Cerner, Epic being big US names, right? And startup Juniper from Toronto, plus Smile CDR, who's a Canadian, a bright Canadian company. They are probably one of the most famous open source providers of the FHIR server that is also part of their core product, the Happy server. You probably have heard of it. So these were the companies that have signed up. So in terms of key highlights, we have a couple of them listed on the document, but I would rather talk a little bit about the experience itself. This is how the testing was organized. We had the Projectathon was organized over 3 days using the Gazelle platform, and day 1 and 2 was focused on no peer testing and peer-to-peer testing. This means using the simulators, vendors that couldn't quite finish all their tests before the Projectathon spend the first day trying their systems against these simulators to be ready to start exchanging information with the others. And then the second day and the beginning of third, we're focused on peer-to-peer testing. So we did not expect a huge throughput of tests actually to go through the system, being that everybody was learning this process and we were new to this. But according to IHE Catalyst, the 67 tests that were run during the Projectathon are phenomenal in the realm of Projectathon, especially for first time. Apparently, vendors take quite a bit of time to get used to this environment, but once they get used to it, it goes better, right? So anyway, the feedback we received was pretty positive. So the first 2 days, as I said, were technical in nature, connectivity testing, and then the third day was more of a symposium format, something similar to what we're doing here today. We divided the day in 4 sessions, and the presentations were more of an open roundtable where we had facilitation from some of the project contributors. And we tried to focus on a data model in the first one. The second was mainly focused on the exchange with the reference architecture at the center, trying to understand what supporting profiles are the most important. And we had a demonstration there for internet user authorization and smart FHIR exchanges. And then we had one on document management, because there's different patterns for document management. For example, the mobile health document is a profile that explains a lighter weight of document management. XDS is a heavy but very well-established way of exchanging documents. And then there was also CAFAX for greenfield, modern new FHIR approaches, right? So those were discussed there. And then the final one was focused on clinical workflow, where some physicians were part of the conversation and were leading the discussion. So we had pretty good show. About 40-45 people were present on day 3. And the early learnings from this was that it's not very surprising, quite frankly, but it's worth noting. vendors would rather see that the specification is stable for at least 6 months before it is presented on the Gazelle platform. And they also need quite a bit of lead time to get their products ready for something like this. In general, they pointed to anywhere between 6 months to a year to have access to the specification to entertain participation. Also, we were told that the 3 days that we had, especially only 2 focused on testing, are way too short. Believe it or not, they wanted a longer runway and asked for the 5 days that usually IHE Connectathons run for. And so that's a lesson learned for us. Next Connectathon, Projectathon will be significantly longer, give vendors time to absorb and to prepare and exchange. And then we also learned a little bit, we offered a number of training opportunities to vendors before the Projectathon even started, but they were focused mainly on trying to train them through webinars on how Gazelle works and this and that, but they feel like a live support focused directly on how do they integrate the specification and how that is represented in Gazelle might be a better time spent. So we're taking that into account. And more expectations regarding group testing, like when multiple vendors come together to run a scenario. So that was the feedback, but at the same time, we were very pleased to see that pretty much overwhelmingly the vendors said that they absolutely enjoyed the Projectathon. It was a fantastic technical event. It was a great opportunity to truly connect with other vendors to see how does their product really fare when it comes to international interoperability. And this was fantastic because you had American companies and Canadian companies in a virtual event supported by a group from France run by us in Toronto. So this is truly something, the first in Canadian history, and I'm hoping that it's going to grow. We received several kudos from IHE International, and IHE Canada was also present. So now the last slide is focusing on next steps. Some of this you have heard in Abby's presentation. We want to really focus on how do we grow this approach. We feel that we probably have a very good recipe here for success. The specification for patient summaries was developed in less than a year, and it was in collaboration with jurisdictions, and it was in collaboration with the market. It was done transparently, and it is very tightly connected to implementable and testable approaches. And so we want to make sure that both the specification grows, but also the interoperability program. The specification is part of grows. And in order for this to work, we would like to create a roadmap that's supported by proper governance and change management processes, so that jurisdictions on one hand take advantage of us working with the market to implement one specification and done, and then they don't need to customize them anymore, so vendors can just take a product and take it everywhere. There's a little bit of give and take on both sides, obviously, because you have to buy in to the fact that if this is a profile that's published, then you accept it as is. You still have a ton of flexibility in how you organize your ecosystem, because you can plug Lego pieces into each other in various ways. Just don't invent new Lego pieces for the same problem, which is not to say don't invent Lego pieces, because that's also part of our governance. We would like to encourage jurisdictions to innovate, only bring that to the interoperability table, and let's grow this thing together. So that's basically the presentation, and I'm going to stop now and take some questions.